The rain hammered against the diner windows like 1,000 desperate fingers, each drop a tiny plea for shelter. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the storm devour the empty street outside. 23 years old, $300 in her bank account, and a foreclosure notice that had arrived that morning, her grandmother's diner. The last piece of family she had left would be gone in 30 days. The coffee in her trembling hands had gone cold an hour ago, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Sometimes the weight of the world doesn't crush you all at once. Sometimes it just keeps piling on, one loss after another, until you forget what it felt like to stand up straight. The bell above the door chimed, and Sarah turned to see a woman stumble inside, soaked to the bone. She looked about 60, maybe older, with silver hair plastered to her face and clothes that had seen better decades. Water pooled around her worn sneakers as she stood there, shivering, her eyes darting around the diner like a frightened animal. "We're closed," Sarah heard herself say, the words automatic and hollow. But even as she spoke them, she was already moving toward the kitchen, grabbing a clean towel. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Nobody leaves this place hungry or cold, you hear me?" "Not on our watch." The woman's name was Margaret, and she told her story in fragments between sips of hot coffee, a medical bill that had wiped out her savings, an eviction 2 weeks ago, 3 nights sleeping in her car before it broke down on the highway. She'd been walking for hours when the storm hit, and Sarah's diner was the first light she'd seen. Sarah made her a grilled cheese sandwich with tomato soup, her grandmother's specialty, and watched Margaret's hands shake as she ate. Each bite seemed to restore something in her, some piece of dignity that the streets had tried to steal. And in that moment, watching this stranger eat food she could barely afford to give away, Sarah made a decision that made absolutely no sense. She offered Margaret the apartment above the diner, the tiny space her grandmother had lived in until the end, sitting empty now except for memories and dust. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I can't pay you," she whispered. "Then help me save this place," Sarah said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I've got 30 days before they take it. Maybe together we can figure something out." It started small. Margaret had been a bookkeeper before life unraveled, so she began sorting through the diner's chaotic finances, finding expenses Sarah didn't know existed in old receipts that told the story of her grandmother's generosity. For every paying customer, there were 3 or 4 who had eaten on credit or promises, or simply because they were hungry. The diner had been hemorrhaging money for years, but her grandmother had never stopped feeding people. Word spread slowly at first. Margaret mentioned to another homeless woman at the shelter that Sarah's diner was safe, that nobody would turn her away. That woman told 2 others. Then a veteran named Carlos stopped by, having heard there was a place that would hire day laborers even if their papers weren't perfect. Sarah put him to work fixing the broken booths and the temperamental stove, paying him in meals and whatever cash she could scrape together. Each person who walked through that door carried their own weight of invisible burdens. There was Janet, the single mother working 3 jobs who would sneak her, kids in after school because she couldn't afford a sitter. Tommy, the teenager whose parents had kicked him out for being gay, who studied for his GED in the corner booth every night. Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow who had stopped speaking after her husband died, until Margaret coaxed words out of her again over cups of chamomile tea. The diner became something Sarah hadn't planned and couldn't quite name. Not charity, because everyone contributed what they could. Carlos fixed things, Margaret managed the books, Janet started baking pies, Tommy bussed tables, Mrs. Chen taught Sarah her husband's dumpling recipe that brought in curious customers from 3 towns over. It was more like an ecosystem of broken people learning to hold each other up. But the calendar kept marching forward, and the 30 days shrank to 20, then 10. They'd increased business with Mrs. Chen's dumplings and Janet's pies, but it wasn't enough. Sarah lay awake each night doing math that never worked out, trying to find money that didn't exist. The day she would lose everything loomed like a storm cloud that refused to break. 7 days before the deadline, Sarah arrived at the diner to find the morning news van parked outside. A reporter named Diana had heard about the place, not from social media or any publicity stunt, but from her own mother, Mrs. Chen, who had finally told her daughter where she'd been spending her days. Diana wanted to tell the story, but Sarah hesitated. This wasn't about attention. It was never supposed to be about attention. "Let her," Margaret urged. "People need to know places like this still exist. People like us still exist." The story aired on a Tuesday evening. Diana had captured everything. The cracked vinyl booths, the mismatched plates, the faces of people who had found something they'd lost. Sarah watching Margaret teach Tommy how to balance a register. Carlos laughing with Janet's. Kids while flipping pancakes. Mrs. Chen's hands moving with precision as she folded dumplings. The first smile on her face in 2 years. But Diana had also done something Sarah hadn't expected. She'd ended the segment with the foreclosure notice. With the countdown with a simple question. What happens to a community when we let places like this disappear? Sarah's phone started ringing before the segment even ended. $5 from a teacher in Ohio, $20 from a retired firefighter in California, $50 from a nurse in Texas, who said the diner reminded her of her own grandmother's place. The donations were small, individual acts of kindness from strangers who would never eat Mrs. Chen's dumplings or taste Janet's pie, but who understood that some things were worth saving. By morning, they'd raised $8,000. By the end of the week, $23,000. Enough to stop the foreclosure, enough to make repairs, enough to keep going. But more than the money were the letters and emails, hundreds of them, from people sharing their own stories of struggling, of being saved by someone's unexpected kindness, of places and people who had caught them when they fell. On day 30, Sarah stood in the diner surrounded by her improbable family. Margaret, Carlos, Janet and her kids, Tommy, Mrs. Chen, and dozens of others who had found their way to this place. The deed was safe. The doors would stay open. But something more profound had shifted. Something Sarah was still trying to understand. "You know what your grandmother used to tell me?" Margaret said, her arm around Sarah's shoulders. "She said the world's full of people waiting to be kind. If you just show them where it's needed most." Sarah thought about that. About the reporter's mother who had finally found her voice. About the strangers who had sent $5 and $10 and $20. About the way broken people had come together and somehow made something whole. She thought about how close she'd come to giving up, to putting up that closed sign and walking away from the weight of it all. Tommy was teaching Carlos how to use social media to promote the daily specials. Janet was training a new hire, another single mother who needed flexible hours. Margaret was on the phone with a local landlord, trying to help someone else find housing. Mrs. Chen was showing a young couple how to make dumplings, their laughter filling the space where silence used to live. This was never just about saving a diner, Sarah realized. It was about proving that the connections between us are stronger than the things that try to break us apart. That kindness isn't weakness, it's the most powerful force we have. That when we see someone drowning, we don't have to be strong enough to save them alone. We just have to be brave enough to reach out and trust that others will reach too, until we've built a chain of hands strong enough to pull everyone to shore. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, and morning sunlight streamed through the windows, painting everything gold. Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee, hot this time, and smiled at the sound of her grandmother's diner coming back to life. Not because one person was strong enough to carry it alone, but because dozens of people, most of whom had nothing to give, had given everything they had. And in the end, that made all the difference.